Consider what you mean when you say a person has lost their soul. You do not usually mean that an immaterial substance has departed their body. You mean something like, the part of them that could be surprised is gone. The part that could be moved, that could change its mind, that could be arrested by something beautiful or shamed by something true. You mean they have become entirely predictable to themselves and to you. When people describe a soul in trouble, they almost always describe a narrowing of attention, of possibility, of response. So take soul here as a name for that capacity, the part of you that can still be reached, the live and mutable interior that is not yet fully committed to a single way of being. This is close to what Iris Murdoch was after in The Sovereignty of Good when she wrote about attention and what she called unselfing, the experience of looking at something outside yourself so completely that the anxious, self-defending commentary in your head stops for a moment. Her famous example is nothing grand. A woman brooding over a resentment happens to see a hovering kestrel, and in the seconds of that seeing, the brooding is simply gone. Murdoch's argument is that moral progress is not mainly a matter of choosing well at the moment of decision. It is a matter of what you have been looking at and how in all the hours before. Because by the time the decision arrives, the seeing has already determined what options are visible. Attention is the moral act. Choice is its residue. Simone Vile made the same claim in a more austere register, that attention, real attention, the kind that suspends your own thought and holds itself ready and empty for what is actually there, is both the rarest thing in human life and the substance of both prayer and love. She also insisted unsentimentally that severe affliction destroys the capacity for it, which is why she refused to romanticize suffering as a teacher. That refusal matters later in this essay, and I will come back to it. If you prefer, then the soul is your attention plus your capacity to be changed by what you attend to. The 5 patterns are 5 ways attention gets captured, and captured attention is the mechanism of every kind of unfreedom in this essay. A frightened person attends only to the threat. An attached person attends only to the object. A traumatized person attends to a danger that ended years ago. An egobound person attends to the mirror. A person in compulsive repetition has stopped attending altogether and is running from memory. What they have in common is not a moral failure, it is a foreclosure of the field of view. 3. The first captivity, fear. Being controlled by terror or the dread of mortality. Start with the strangest fact about fear, which is that it is almost never the fear that runs your life. It is the avoidance. In 1947, the psychologist O Hobart Mauer proposed what became known as two-factor theory, and it remains one of the more quietly devastating ideas in the study of human behavior. Fear is learned by classical conditioning. Something neutral becomes associated with something terrible. But avoidance is maintained by a second and separate process, negative reinforcement. Every time you avoid the feared thing, your fear drops. That drop feels wonderful. It is rewarding. And because you have now escaped, you never get the chance to discover whether the terrible thing would actually have happened. The avoidance protects the fear from ever being corrected. This is why phobias do not fade with time the way most learned associations do. The behavior that feels like management is the behavior that guarantees permanence. Sit with the reach of that. A person who has not asked for what they want in 15 years experiences their silence as prudence. Every unasked question is an emergency they successfully prevented. The relief is real, the evidence is never gathered. They have built a life optimized entirely around never running the experiment. And from the inside, this feels not like fear, but like realism. The whole architecture of the fear is invisible because what you see is only a series of of sensible decisions not to. Exposure-based treatments work by breaking that loop, and they are among the most reliably supported interventions in clinical psychology. Napo and Michael Kak's emotional processing account describes the mechanism as activating the fear structure and then feeding it information incompatible with it, which is a technical way of saying you have to be afraid and stay long enough for something new to be learned. Every philosophical tradition that has taken fear seriously has said a version of this in its own idiom. The Stoics called it premeditatio malorum, the deliberate rehearsal of what you dread, on the theory that a disaster you have already walked through in imagination has lost its power to abduct you. Epictetus, who had been a slave and knew something about the difference between what can and cannot be taken, taught that the entire question of freedom reduces to distinguishing what is up to you from what is not, and that misery is the predictable result of staking your peace on the second category. But the deepest layer of fear is not situational. It is the one the source text names directly, the dread of mortality. Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death, which won the Pulitzer in 1974 shortly after Becker himself died of cancer, argued that the terror of annihilation is so intolerable that essentially all of human culture is an elaborate apparatus for hiding it from ourselves. We construct what Becker called immortality projects: the nation, the church, the fortune, the body of work, the child who carries the name. We seek to be part of something that will outlast us because we cannot look directly at the fact that we will not. Becker's thesis inspired an entire experimental program, terror management theory, developed by Jeff Greenberg, Tom Pyshinsky, and Sheldon Solomon beginning in the mid-1980s, which reported that prompting people to think about their own death made them defend their cultural worldview more aggressively, punish transgressors more harshly, and cling more tightly to their group. Hundreds of studies followed. Honesty requires noting that the effect has had a hard decade. A large multi-laboratory replication effort published in 2019 failed to reproduce the classic mortality salience finding, and the field is now genuinely divided about how robust the experimental core is. I include this not to discredit Becker, whose argument is philosophical and largely untouched by the fate of any particular paradigm, but because the discipline of saying this part is contested is exactly the discipline this essay is about. A framework you cannot doubt in its details is a religion, and you should know which one you're in. What survives, regardless of the laboratory result, is the phenomenology. And the phenomenology is what you can check yourself. Notice how much of your behavior is a small, well-mannered flinch away from finitude, the refusal to make the will, the compulsive productivity that has no destination, the inability to sit in a room without a screen. Heidegger called the state of being submerged in the anonymous chatter of everyone and no one, das Man, and he thought that authentic existence begins only when a person stops treating death as something that happens to other people and takes it up as their own most possibility, not morbidly, but as the thing that makes any moment matter in the first place. Montaigne, writing 4 centuries earlier and much more warmly, titled an essay with the old Ciceronian line that to philosophize is to learn how to die, and then spent the essay arguing that a man who has made friends with his death has been released from servitude to everything else. Both are saying that the fear of death is the master key to every other fear, and that the only exit is through. The practical form of this is not a mood, it is a question, and it appears in the audit. What fear is currently making my choices for me, not what frightens me. The list is long and mostly irrelevant. What fear currently holds the steering wheel? In most lives at any given time, there is exactly one, and it is usually not the one you would name first. 4. The second captivity, attachment. The compulsive need to possess or cling to people, status, or outcomes. We must immediately separate two words that English is unhelpfully merged, because a great deal of confused self-help lives in the collision. In developmental psychology, following John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, attachment is a good thing and a biological necessity. It names the bond between a child and a caregiver that provides what Ainsworth called a secure base, a place safe enough that the child can leave it. The counterintuitive finding of half a century of research is that securely attached children explore more, not less. The bond is not the opposite of freedom. It is the precondition for it. Adults are not different in kind. People with secure bonds take more risks, tolerate more ambiguity, and recover faster from failure. Any philosophy that tells you to need no one is not describing maturity. It is describing a defense. In the Buddhist analysis, attachment means something else entirely. The second noble truth identifies the origin of suffering as tanha, craving or thirst, which hardens into upadana, grasping or clinging, the fixed insistence that a thing must be, must stay, must be mine. The object of the grasping is almost irrelevant. It can be a person, a self-image, a career outcome, a political vindication, the version of the past in which you were treated fairly. What produces the suffering is not the caring. It is the demand that reality holds still. So the captivity here is not love and it is not desire. It is the conversion of a preference into a condition of survival. The moment something becomes load-bearing for your ability to be all right at all, you have handed it a set of keys, and you will begin without ever deciding to distort yourself in order to keep it. This is measurable. Jennifer Crocker and Connie Wolf's work on contingencies of self-worth found that what predicts psychological cost is not how high your self-esteem is, but what it is staked on. Students whose worth was contingent on academic performance experienced sharper collapses after rejection. Those whose worth was contingent on appearance or on others' approval showed more anxiety, more stress, and, in the case of approval contingency, less autonomy in their choices. The mechanism is straightforward. The more of your existence a domain is carrying, the less you can afford to be honest about it. The Stoic response was to relocate the load. Epictetus's advice on loss is famously cold, and read carefully is not cold at all. Never say of anything that you have lost it, only that you have given it back. The child, the partner, the house held as things on loan. They can be loved fully without being clutched, because the clutching was never what kept them anyway. Marcus Aurelius, writing privately to himself in a military camp, kept returning to the same discipline. Everything you love is a thing in the process of changing, and you knew that when you started. There's a hard edge here worth naming honestly. Non-attachment can be counterfeited. A person can adopt the language of release and be practicing something closer to preemptive abandonment, withdrawing first, refusing to want anything visibly, calling their inability to depend on anyone's spiritual progress. The tale is simple and worth memorizing. Real non-attachment increases your capacity to be present with someone. Counterfeit non-attachment decreases it. If your equanimity requires distance to sustain itself, it is not equanimity. It is a moat with a philosophy attached. Erich Fromm drew the same line in a different vocabulary in to have or to be. In the having mode, love is a possession, and possessions must be guarded, which means the beloved must be constrained. In the being mode, love is an activity, something you do continuously that has no object to secure. Fromm's point in The Art of Loving was that most people treat love as a problem of being loved rather than a problem of loving. And so they work on becoming lovable and never learn the skill itself. Attachment as captivity is the having mode of every human relation, to people, to reputation, to the past, to the outcome you were promised. The audit's question here is, what can I release without abandoning myself? And the second half of that question is doing all the work. Release that costs you. Your standards is not release. It is capitulation dressed for ceremony. 5. The third, captivity. Trauma. Recreating familiar pain because it feels known or safe. Of the 5, this is the one most likely to be misunderstood as an accusation, so let us be exact about the mechanism. Because the mechanism exonerates the person even as it names the pattern. Freud noticed it first and could not explain it within his own system. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, written in the aftermath of a war that had filled Europe with men who dreamed nightly of the trenches, he confronted the fact that people compulsively return to experiences that give them no pleasure whatsoever. He called it Wiederholungsdrang, repetition compulsion, and his eventual explanation of death drive is one that few now accept. But the observation was sound, and it has been re-derived repeatedly since by traditions that share nothing with psychoanalysis. The learning theory account is less mystical and considerably more useful. 3 findings do most of the work. The first is Bowlby's concept of internal working models. From early relationships, we build implicit templates of what people are and what closeness costs and what we can expect to receive. These templates are not beliefs you can argue with. They are priors operating below the level of narration, generating a sense of rightness or wrongness about people within seconds of meeting them. A person raised in volatility does not consciously prefer volatility. They experience calm is flat and intensity is real. Nothing is being chosen, something is being recognized. The second is B.F. Skinner's finding about reinforcement schedules, which explains more about destructive relationships than any amount of talk about self-esteem. Behavior reinforced every time extinguishes quickly once the reward stops. Behavior reinforced unpredictably, sometimes yes, sometimes nothing. No discernible pattern is the most persistent behavior we know how to produce in a living organism. It is why slot machines work. It is also precisely the structure of life with someone who's cruel and then tender and then cruel again. The intermittency is not incidental to the grip. It is the grip. Dutton and Painter named the result traumatic bonding in 1981, and the crucial implication is moral as much as it is scientific. The strength of a person's attachment to someone who hurts them is not evidence of weak character. It is evidence of an extremely effective reinforcement schedule, and it would have worked on you. The third is that avoidance again seals the whole thing shut. Trauma narrows the world. The narrowing brings relief. Relief reinforces the narrowing. The territory available for new learning shrinks year by year, and everything left inside the shrunken territory resembles the original injury, because that was the shape of the room the person had to build. Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score brought the somatic dimension of this to an enormous readership, and it deserves credit for that, even as some of its stronger claims about specific treatments run ahead of the evidence. The core insight that traumatic memory is not stored or retrieved like ordinary autobiographical memory, and that it manifests in physiology, posture, startle, and sleep long before it manifests in narration, is well supported, and it explains why understanding your history does not by itself change your reactions. You cannot reason your way out of a response that was never installed by reasoning. 2 further honesties. First, on growth. The literature on post-traumatic growth, developed by Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, is often cited to suggest that suffering reliably makes people deeper. What the more careful work shows is subtler and less comforting. Retrospective self-reports of growth frequently fail to match actual measured change when researchers assess people before and after. Some of what is reported appears to be a meaning-making narrative rather than a documented transformation. That narrative may be valuable in its own right. Weil would say affliction more often crushes than teaches, and she was closer to the truth than the posters are. Suffering is not a curriculum. It is a fact. Whatever you make of it afterward is your achievement, not its gift. Second, on responsibility, nothing in this section implies that a person recreated their pain on purpose. The word recreating in the source text should be heard as a description of a system, not an indictment of a will. What is yours is the moment after recognition. Before you can see the pattern, you are not culpable. You are conditioned. After you can see it, you're not culpable either. But you are, from that moment forward, the only person in a position to interrupt it. This is the whole of the ethical weight here, and it is enough. Seek the fourth captivity, ego. Identifying solely with one's name, social role, possessions, or history. The trouble with the word ego is that it has been used to mean arrogance for so long that we no longer hear what it originally pointed at, which is not arrogance but identification, the reflex by which a set of contingent facts about you hardens into what you take yourself to be, after which any threat to those facts registers as a threat to your existence. David Hume put the philosophical case bluntly in the treatise. Whenever he went looking inward for the self, he found only particular perceptions, a warmth, an irritation, a color, a thought, and never the perceiver. He concluded that what we call a self is a bundle of experiences, held together by memory and habit rather than an object that exists in its own right. The Buddhist doctrine of anatta had reached a strikingly similar conclusion 2,000 years earlier, and drew from it the ethical consequence Hume did not. If the self is a process rather than a possession, then defending it as though it were a possession is a category error, and a great deal of human cruelty is the byproduct of that error. Modern social psychology approached the same territory from below. Mark Leary's sociometer theory proposes that self-esteem is not really a measure of worth at all. It is an internal gauge of your perceived acceptance by the group, an instrument evolved to warn you when you are at risk of exclusion. This reframes the entire experience of wounded pride. When your status is threatened and you feel that hot, sick, urgent need to correct the record, you're not experiencing a philosophical crisis. You are experiencing a smoke alarm that evolved when exile meant death. Kipling Williams's cyberball experiments demonstrated how absurdly sensitive that alarm is. Being excluded from a trivial online ball-tossing game by strangers you will never meet reliably produces measurable distress within a couple of minutes, even when participants are told the other players are computers. This matters because it dissolves the moralism around ego. You are not vain for feeling the alarm. You are equipped with it. The captivity is not the alarm. It is organizing an entire life around never letting it sound. What does that organizing look like? Sartre described one form with permanent precision. The cafe waiter whose movements are slightly too exact, who's playing at being a waiter, who has resolved the terror of his own freedom by becoming a function. Sartre called it bad faith, the flight from the vertigo of being able to choose into the comfort of being a thing with a fixed nature. Irving Goffman, working sociologically rather than existentially, showed how much of ordinary life is performance with front and back regions, and how exhausting it becomes when the back region disappears and there is nowhere left to be off-duty. Kierkegaard, earlier and darker, defined despair not as sadness, but as the condition of not willing to be oneself, a state a person can inhabit for decades, while appearing entirely fine, and importantly, while being widely admired for the performance. There's research finding here that should be better known. Roy Baumeister and colleagues conducted a major review of the self-esteem literature in 2003 and concluded, against the assumptions of an entire era of educational policy, that high self-esteem does not cause better academic performance, better job performance, or reduced risky behavior, and that under threat, high but unstable self-esteem is associated with more aggression, not less. What Krista Neff's subsequent work suggests is that the more useful construct is self-compassion. Treating yourself with the ordinary decency you would extend to a friend having a hard time, recognizing failure as a feature of being human, rather than as evidence of a defective self. Self-compassion, unlike self-esteem, does not require you to be above average at anything, and therefore does not require you to defend a ranking, which points at the deepest problem with ego identification. A self built out of comparisons must be maintained by comparison forever, and comparison has no terminus. The name, the role, the possessions, the history, these are real, they're yours, and none of them is you, because all of them are things that can be lost, while the one who loses them remains to notice. Dan McAdams' work on narrative identity shows that we are inveterate storytellers about our own lives, and that the shape of the story matters. People who narrate their setbacks as redemptive sequences, where difficulty led somewhere, tend to show greater generativity and well-being than people whose narratives are contamination sequences, where good things get spoiled. The story is not optional, but it can be revised, and knowing that it is a story rather than a stone is most of the freedom on offer. 7. The fifth captivity, compulsive repetition. Falling into the same harmful cycles without conscious intervention. Everything above converges here in the most physical of the five. Aristotle stated the principle before there was any science to support it. We become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. Virtue for him was hexis, a settled disposition built by repetition, which means character is not something you have and then express it. It is the accumulated sediment of what you have repeatedly done. William James, in the chapter on habit in his 1890 Principles of Psychology, gave this a nervous system reading and a warning that is not aged, that we are all walking bundles of habits. That habit is the flywheel keeping society in motion, and that by the time a person is in their 30s, the character has for most purposes set like plaster. He advised students ominously and correctly that every act leaves its scar, and that nothing we ever do is truly wiped out. The neuroscience has since specified the machinery. Anne Grable's research on the basal ganglia describes how a sequence of actions, repeated enough, becomes chunked, compressed into a single unit that fires as a whole once its initiating cue appears. Neural activity concentrates at the beginning and end of the sequence and thins out in the middle. The brain marks where the routine starts and where it finishes and stops attending in between. This is why you can arrive home with no memory of the drive. It is also why you can arrive at the end of a fight with no memory of choosing any of the sentences you said. Wendy Wood and colleagues found in diary studies that roughly 43% of everyday behaviors performed almost daily and in the same physical location, which is to say, cued by context rather than decided by intention. Wood's larger conclusion, drawn out in her later work, is the practically important one. Habits are not defeated by resolve. They are defeated by changing the environment that cues them. The single best predictor of whether someone maintains a new behavior after a life disruption, a move, a new job, is whether the disruption removed the old cues. Willpower is a bad lever because it operates on the wrong system. The chunk is already fired by the time deliberation arrives. Daniel Kahneman's two-system framing popularized the underlying architecture. A fast, automatic, associative system that produces most of your responses, and a slow, effortful system that mostly ratifies them afterward, while believing it decided. A caution in the spirit of this essay. Some specific findings in that literature, particularly around ego depletion, have failed to replicate, and Kahneman himself said so publicly. The broad two-process distinction is far better supported than any individual experiment cited for it. What can actually be done then? The evidence points away from heroic effort and toward three humbler things. The first is cue removal. If the behavior's context triggered, the highest leverage intervention is upstream of the moment of temptation, and it is usually physical rather than psychological. This is unglamorous and it works. The second is implementation intentions. Peter Gollwitzer's finding that specifying in advance the precise if-then link. If situation X arises, I will do Y, substantially improves follow-through compared with holding a general goal. The meta-analysis he conducted with Pascal Sheeran across 94 studies found a medium to large effect. The mechanism is that you are preloading an autonomic response so that the automatic system has something to fire other than the old chunk. You're not fighting the machinery, you are programming it. The third is urge surfing from Alan Marlat's relapse prevention work. The practice of treating a craving or a reactive impulse as a wave with a rising edge, a crest and a decline, and simply observing it without acting on the empirical basis that urges are self-limiting and pass on their own within a bounded window, if not fed. This is where the contemplative traditions and the clinical ones meet exactly, because the instruction is identical to what a meditation teacher would say, and it is teaching the same skill, the tolerance of an internal state without conversion into behavior. That skill, more than any belief, is the substance of what the source text calls graduation. Hannah Arendt, watching a bureaucrat on trial in Jerusalem, gave the darkest possible statement of what is at stake in automaticity. What struck her about Eichmann was not demonic malice, but thoughtlessness. A man made of cliches, incapable of thinking from any standpoint but his own, doing monstrous things in a state of profound ordinariness. Her point, endlessly misquoted, was not that evil is banal in the sense of being small. It was that the absence of thinking in a person embedded in the wrong system is sufficient for atrocity. No further ingredient is required. The stakes of the gap between stimulus and response are not merely personal. 8. Interlude. The shadow and the danger of loving your own diagnosis. The source text says that once we identify the shadows of these 5 patterns, we can begin to visualize the light of the objective. Before proceeding to that objective, a warning is owed, because this is the precise point at which most inner work goes quietly wrong. Jung's concept of the shadow named everything a person has disowned, not only the cruelty and appetite, but the ambition, the talent, the anger that would have been useful and consigned to a region they refuse to look at, from which it operates anyway, mostly by being projected onto other people. His clinical claim was that integration, not extermination, is the goal. You do not defeat the disowned material, you take it back, and in doing so, you get the energy that was bound up in the disowning. That is a genuinely useful idea, and I use it freely here. The danger is what happens next. A person learns a typology, 5 patterns, 4 temperaments, 9 types. 12 houses and experiences a jolt of recognition so strong that the typology stops being an instrument and becomes an identity. In 1948, Bertram Forer gave his students what he told them were individualized personality profiles derived from a test they had taken. In fact, every student received the same text assembled from a newsstand astrology column. Asked to rate its accuracy on a 5-point scale, the class averaged around 4.3. The statements worked because they were universally applicable and mildly flattering, and because a person who wants to be seen will do most of the work of being seen themselves. The lesson is not that self-knowledge is impossible. It is that the feeling of insight is a terrible measure of whether insight has occurred. Recognition is cheap. It is generated abundantly by good writing, by anything that names a common human experience in a specific sounding way, and by any framework flexible enough to accommodate any evidence. This essay is not exempt. If reading the 5 captivities you found yourself nodding continuously and thinking, yes, all 5 exactly me, that is not confirmation. That is the forward effect operating on you in real time. So here's the discipline that separates an audit from a horoscope. And it is the only thing that does. An honest self-assessment must be capable of producing a prediction that could turn out to be wrong. Not I have an attachment pattern. Nothing follows from that, and nothing could contradict it. But I predict that within the next 3 weeks, when this specific person does not reply within a day, I will draft and delete at least 2 messages and will feel a physical drop in my chest. Then wait and see. If you were right, you have learned something that was not available by introspection because you have caught the pattern operating on a schedule rather than in retrospect. If you were wrong, you have learned something better, that your model of yourself is not as good as it feels, which is the beginning of actually knowing anything. Jung himself is often quoted as saying that until the unconscious is made conscious, it directs your life, and you call it fate. The line is doing something more precise than it appears. It does not say the unconscious is mystical. It says that unexamined causation gets attributed to destiny, that we mistake the reliable output of our own machinery for the way the world simply is. The word fate in that sentence is a synonym for a pattern operating outside your view, which means the whole work of an audit is to convert as much fate as possible into weather you can see coming. 9. What graduation actually means. The source text is careful about something crucial. Graduation is not perfection. It is a transition into maturity, where you are no longer a slave to automatic reactions. I want to hold that definition to a high standard by asking for each of its 6 traits what the trait consists of concretely, how you would know if you had it, and what the evidence says about how it is acquired. Awareness over automatic reaction. The claim is that a person can replace autopilot with sustained, intentional presence. 2 things must be said about it, one supportive and one deflationary. The supportive thing, this is measurable, and the measurements are striking. Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert built a phone application that sampled thousands of people at random moments and asked what they were doing, what they were thinking about, and how they felt. Their 2010 science paper reported that people's minds were elsewhere than their present activity roughly 47% of the time. And this is the part that matters, that mind wandering predicted lower happiness at the next sampling, while unhappiness did not predict subsequent mind wandering. The arrow appears to run from absence to unhappiness rather than the reverse. Nearly half of waking life is spent somewhere else, and being somewhere else costs something. Clinically, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, a program built specifically to interrupt the automatic ruminative cascade that reinstates depression, has performed well in the strongest trials. John Teasdale and colleagues found in 2000 that it substantially reduced relapse in patients with 3 or more prior episodes. And a 2016 individual patient data meta-analysis led by Willem Koken across 9 trials found reduced relapse over 60 weeks compared with usual care, with the benefit again concentrated among those with the heaviest history. That last detail is important and often dropped. The intervention helps most where the automaticity is most entrenched. It is not a general enhancement, it is a brake on a specific machine, the deflationary thing. Sustained awareness of the now is not a state anyone occupies continuously, and holding yourself to that standard converts a practice into another arena for failure. What is actually achievable is a change in recovery time, how long it takes you to notice you have gone. The unit of progress is not the length of your presence, but the shortening of your absences. That is a humbler metric, and it is the true one, power used ethically. The source text describes moving beyond domination into responsible influence. This is the trait for which the empirical literature is most unnerving, because it suggests the problem is not that powerful people are worse people, but that power itself degrades a specific faculty. Dasher Keltner's research program, summarized in The Power Paradox, finds that people typically acquire power through qualities like empathy, generosity, and attention to others, and that possessing it reliably erodes those same qualities. Adam Galinsky and colleagues showed the mechanism in a wonderfully simple experiment. Participants primed with high power were markedly worse at a task requiring them to take another person's visual perspective, and worse at reading emotional expressions. Power reduces the automatic tendency to simulate other minds. It does this to ordinary undergraduates in a laboratory within minutes. It does not require a villain. Milgram's obedience studies and Zimbardo's prison simulation are the standard citations for the darker version of this claim, and both now require asterisks. Milgram's core finding that a majority of ordinary people continued administering what they believed were dangerous shocks under mild institutional pressure is held up across many variations, though the interpretive story has been complicated by evidence that participants' compliance depended heavily on how the authority framed the science, suggesting identification with a cause rather than blind obedience. Zimbardo's study has fared worse. Archival work published by Thibault Letixier in 2019 documented that guards were coached toward brutality rather than spontaneously arriving there, and the demonstration should no longer be cited as evidence that roles automatically corrupt. What follows practically is not humility as a mood, it is humility as a procedure, because the faculty that would tell you that you are misusing power is the faculty power impairs. Ethical power requires external instruments, people with standing to contradict you, structures that make your decisions reversible, a habit of asking those affected rather than imagining their answer. Trusting your own conscience is precisely the strategy the research says will fail. Build the check outside yourself while you still want one, facing death, loss, and uncertainty honestly. Irvin Yalom, who spent a career treating patients at the boundary of existential fear, observed that many people are not afraid of death exactly, but afraid of having not lived, that the dread intensifies in proportion to unlived life. His clinical claim that confronting mortality directly can produce what he called an awakening experience rather than paralysis is echoed in some of the most interesting therapeutic research of the last decade. In 2016, 2 randomized trials, one at Johns Hopkins led by Roland Griffiths, one at NYU led by Stephen Ross, administered psilocybin to patients with life-threatening cancer and severe existential distress. Both reported large, rapid, and sustained reductions in anxiety and depression, with benefits persisting at 6-month follow-up in a majority of participants. Whatever one makes of the pharmacology, the qualitative reports converge on a description that reads, as philosophy rather than medicine, that the fear did not go away because the patients were reassured, but because their relationship to their own finitude changed. Laura Carstenson's socio-emotional selectivity theory approaches the same phenomenon from ordinary life. Her finding is that as people perceive their time horizon shortening with age or with illness, or an experimentally induced to imagine a coming ending, their goals shift systematically away from information gathering and toward emotional meaning. They prune their social circles to people who matter. They savor more. Crucially, the shift tracks perceived time remaining, not chronological age, which means it is available at any age to anyone who genuinely takes their finitude into account, rather than merely conceding it in the abstract. This is the mechanism underneath the audit's most familiar question, and it is why the question is not a cliche. Asking what would matter if your time were short is not a mood-generating exercise. It is a deliberate induction of a documented cognitive shift that reorders your priorities in a direction you would endorse on reflection. Bronnie Ware's widely circulated observations from palliative nursing that the dying regret working too much and living for others' expectations, and not saying what they felt are anecdotal and should not be cited as data. But they rhyme with the data, which is the most you can ask of an anecdote. Protection without cruelty. Firm and compassionate limits rather than aggressive defensiveness. This is the trait most often faked, and the fake is easy to spot once you know the tell. A boundary is a statement about what you will do. A punishment is an attempt to control what someone else does. I'm not available for conversations that go this way. I'll leave the room if it continues. Is a boundary, it is fully executable by you alone, requires no compliance, and costs the other person nothing but your presence. You need to stop talking to me like that is a demand. And if it does not work, it will escalate because demands have nowhere to go but louder. The confusion between the two is why so many people who have been told to set boundaries end up in worse conflict. They were sold the vocabulary of self-respect and taught the grammar of control. Marsha Linehan's dialectical framework built for people whose emotional systems make this territory extraordinarily difficult is organized around exactly this tension. Full acceptance of the person as they are, held simultaneously with an insistence on change. Neither half works alone. Acceptance without change is abandonment. Change without acceptance is contempt. The dialectic is not a compromise between them, but the practice of holding both. And it is difficult in the specific way that adulthood is difficult. The assertiveness literature running from Alberti and Emmons' early work forward adds a useful ordering. The three available postures are passive, aggressive, and assertive. And the crucial finding for people raised in conflict, avoidant or conflict-saturated homes, is that most people who fear becoming aggressive are actually oscillating between passive and aggressive because unexpressed limits accumulate pressure and eventually vent. The path out of cruelty is not further suppression. It is earlier, smaller, more frequent statements of position, made while the stakes are low enough that kindness is still affordable. Love without ownership, trading possession and emotional bargaining for connection that does not require constraint. Trump's distinction between having and being underlies this, but there is empirical work that makes it unusually concrete. Carol Rusbelt and Stephen Dragotas described what they named the Michelangelo phenomenon. Partners sculpt one another and the direction of the sculpting is not neutral. When a partner perceives and behaves toward you in ways aligned with your own ideal self, you actually move toward that ideal over time, and both relationship satisfaction and personal well-being improve. When a partner sculpts toward their preferred version of you, what the researchers called Pygmalion, and it is the right illusion, the relationship suffers, and so does the person. The finding is that the difference between love that liberates and love that possesses is not a matter of intensity or devotion. It is a matter of whose ideal is being served, and it produces measurably different people over years. Arthur Aron's self-expansion model points the same way ostamente. We're drawn into close relationships in part because they enlarge the self. New capacities, new perspectives, new resources become in some sense yours. The clinical corollary is that relationships fail not only from conflict but from contraction. When the enlargement stops and both parties become smaller than they were, ownership contracts. It has to. The whole point of ownership is that the thing stays put. Emotional bargaining deserves a specific note because it is so common, it is nearly invisible. It is the trait of care for compliance. I will be warm to you if you do the thing. My withdrawal is your consequence. It works in the short run, which is exactly the trouble. And it is the intermittent reinforcement schedule from the trauma section run from the other side of the table, which means that the person doing it is building in someone they love a bond of precisely the kind that is hardest to leave and worst to be inside. Responsibility without drowning in shame. The last trait is the one where research offers the sharpest and most practically valuable distinction in this entire essay, and it turns on two words most people use interchangeably. June Tangney and Rhonda Deering's program of research, summarized in Shame and Guilt, 2002, separates them decisively. Guilt is about the act. I did a bad thing. Shame is about the self. I am a bad thing. Because guilt keeps the self intact while condemning the behavior. It motivates the behavior that repairs apology, confession, restitution, change conduct. Because shame indicts the whole person, it produces an overwhelming urge to hide, and hiding is incompatible with repair. Worse, Taney's data indicate that shame-proneness is associated with externalizing blame and with anger, because the self under total indictment will do almost anything to get out from under it, including attacking the person who witnessed the failure. This is why the most shame-ridden people are frequently the least accountable, and why demanding that someone feel worse is a reliably counterproductive strategy for making them behave better. The practical upshot inverts intuition. If you want someone to take responsibility, including yourself, you must protect their worth. While you name the damage, not soften the damage, protect the worth. Kristen Neff's self-compassion research supports this from the other direction, finding that self-compassion is associated with greater personal accountability and greater willingness to acknowledge one's role in negative events, not less. The fear that self-kindness produces license turns out to be backwards. It is self-attack that produces evasion. Jonathan Shea's work with Vietnam veterans, and later Brett Litz's formalization of moral injury, extends this to the hardest cases, the injury of having done or failed to prevent something that violates your own moral core. What Shea found in the veteran's recovery was not absolution and not forgetting. It was a reconstruction of a moral world in which the act could be held, which required a community willing to hear the account without either condemning the person or minimizing the deed. Aaron Lazar's analysis in non-apology identifies the same components in effective apology: specific acknowledgement of the offense, acceptance of responsibility without qualification, expression of remorse, and reparation. Notice that self-punishment appears nowhere on that list. It is not one of the ingredients. It has never been one of the ingredients. 10. The soul audit, question by question. What follows takes the 10 questions in order. I have tried to write each as it would actually be used, not as a prompt to be answered once and filed, but as an instrument that returns different readings at different times, and that is worth returning to precisely when you least want to. 1. What am I avoiding feeling? The premise of this question is that denied grief calcifies into something harder, and that the hardening is the real damage. The clinical picture supports the premise, though not in the shape most people expect. Margaret Strobel and Henk Schutz's dual process model of bereavement, which is held up well, describes healthy grieving as an oscillation between loss orientation, confronting the loss, feeling it, going through the belongings, and restoration orientation, attending to the practical business of a changed life, doing new things, having an afternoon that is not about it. Neither pole alone is adaptive. The person who cannot approach the loss is in trouble. So is the person who cannot leave it. Avoidance is not a failure to be sad enough. It is the collapse of the oscillation, and one asks the question then with a diagnostic edge. Not am I sad, but which direction can I not go? Toward it or away from it? 2. What fear is currently making my choices for me? The word currently is the whole instrument, and it should be defended against the natural drift toward the biographical. It is easy and useless to answer that you have always been afraid of abandonment. It is difficult and valuable to answer that the email you have not sent for 11 days is not being delayed by busyness. Use the avoidance signature to find it, since fear itself hides better than its consequences. Look for the topic you route around in conversation. Look for the decision you have re-researched 4 times. Look for the relationship in which you have started editing yourself before speaking, and note when the editing began. Maurer's insight tells you where to search. The fear will not be found where you feel afraid. It will be found where you feel relieved. Track the relief backward, and you will arrive at it. There is a second-order trap worth naming. Some people, having done this exercise, conclude that all caution is fear and begin overriding every hesitation as a spiritual discipline. That is not courage. It is a different automatic response wherein courage is closed. The distinguishing question is whether the hesitation is protecting you from a cost or from an unknown. Costs deserve respect. Unknowns rarely do. 3. Where am I blaming someone else for a part I can repair? The source text invokes the drama triangle, and it is worth stating properly because it is one of the more useful maps ever drawn of dysfunctional interaction. Stephen Karpman published it in 1968. 3 roles: persecutor, rescuer, victim, that people rotate through fluidly within a single conversation. The rescuer helps in a way that keeps the other person incapable and resents it. The victim is genuinely suffering and also genuinely not acting, and the not acting is protected by the suffering. The persecutor is often a rescuer whose help was refused. What makes the triangle sticky is that all 3 positions offer a genuine payoff significance, blamelessness, righteousness, and all 3 require the others to keep playing. The exit is not to identify which role you occupy. It is to drop the role you are currently in and take an action that has a real cost to you. That is the only move the triangle does not have a counter for. But the question also needs a guard, because a certain kind of person, usually one raised to absorb responsibility for the emotional weather of a household, will read it as licensed to take everything. It is a common self-protective adaptation, since a child who believes the fault is theirs retains the hope of fixing it, and it is not humility. It is an old strategy for surviving the intolerable. 4. What pattern in my life keeps repeating it? This is where the source text introduces its most metaphysically loaded idea, the reincarnation lesson, and I take that up properly in the next section. Here I want to address the technical difficulty, which is that patterns are extremely hard to see from inside, and the mind is exceptionally good at producing false ones. 2 failures are common. The first is over-detection. Given any life, you can construct a pattern, because human beings find structure and noise reliably and enjoy doing it. The second is under-detection of your own contribution, because your own behavior is the one variable that is present in every instance, and therefore invisible, in the way that you cannot see the lens you're looking through. The correction for both is the same, and it is boring. Go concrete and go plural. Write the last 4 instances, not the general shape. For each, record what happened first, the earliest identifiable moment, the first small compromise, first sentence you did not say. Patterns are usually invisible at their conclusions and obvious at their openings. Almost everyone can describe the ending of their repetitions vividly, and cannot describe the beginnings at all, and this is precisely backwards from where the leverage is. The ending is where the pain is. The beginning is where the choice was. Then apply the falsifiability test from the interlude. State what the pattern predicts about the next 30 days, in terms someone else could verify. If you cannot generate a prediction, you have a story about yourself, not a pattern. 5. What would accountability look like here? Everything in the shame versus guilt research bears on this question, and the operational version is, what would repair require? Stated as actions, with the self-recrimination stripped out entirely. The stripping is the exercise most people ask what accountability looks like. Produce a paragraph in which roughly 80% is a description of how badly they feel and 20% is anything they could actually do. Invert it. Feeling terrible is not a deliverable, and Pertenghi's findings actively obstructs the deliverable. Lazar's components give the format. Name the specific act without euphemism. Accept responsibility without a clause beginning but. Express remorse briefly and once, and propose reparation. There's one further requirement that the literature on restorative justice makes clear, and that almost every private apology omits. The injured party gets to say whether it landed. Lawrence Sherman and Heather Strang's review. And a final caution, accountability is not always accepted, and you are not entitled to absolution as the reward for offering it. That some repairs will be refused is one of the ordinary tragedies of adult life. You do them anyway, because the alternative is that your conduct is contingent on being forgiven, which returns the steering wheel to someone else. 6. Where do I need a boundary rather than forgiveness? Or forgiveness rather than revenge? This question is the most sophisticated of the 10, and it is worth slowing down over, because the surrounding culture gets it badly wrong in a specific and